Next, you have the outline on the rise and the fall of the Antichrist. This will overlap a bit with the previous session, so if we go to the same material, I'll simply summarize what I said before and I'll provide the same complete details. As I mentioned, I was going to see developing in the tribulation is a full-fledged counterfeit trinity, with Satan playing the role of the counterfeit father and the false prophet, the counterfeit son, a false prophet, counterfeit spirit, and the Antichrist will play the role of the counterfeit son. Now, the true son has a multiplicity of names and titles, and every name and title of the true son says something about his person and something about his work. The same thing is true of the counterfeit son. He has a multiplicity of names and titles, but everything says something about his person and his act, his work. Let me just give you, I won't look these passages up because they'll come up as we read the other segments of the outline. Let me give you a basic list of the different names the Bible provides for this person. Of these, there are 11 names altogether, and the first 6 of these names are from the Old Testament. The other 5 are from the New Testament. Among the 6 names of the Old Testament, we have first of all the seed of Satan. The seed of Satan, that would be Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, Genesis 3:15. A second name is the little horn, the little horn. Daniel 7, verse 8, chapter 7, verse 8 of Daniel. A third name is the king of fierce countenance, the king of fierce countenance. That's in Daniel chapter 8, verse 23, Daniel 8:23. The fourth name is the prince that shall come, the prince that shall come. Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, Daniel 9:26. The fifth name is the desolator in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, Daniel 9:27. And last Old Testament name is the willful king. The willful king in Daniel 11, verse 36, 11:36. Notice of the 6 different names in the Old Testament, only one comes from Genesis, all the rest from Daniel. And Daniel is the Old Testament counterpart to the New Testament Revelation book. Now, the names of the Antichrist New Testament, you have first of all the man of sin, and then also, secondly, the son of perdition, And both the man of sin and son of perdition is in the same passage, 2 Thess chapter 2, verse 3, 2 Thess chapter 2, verse 3. The ninth name in Scripture would be the lawless one in 2 Thess chapter 2, verse 8, 2 Thess 2, verse 8. The 10th name is the Antichrist, the most common name we use today. It's not the most common biblical name, but the most common modern name, the Antichrist. And that's in 1 John chapter 2, verse 22, 1 John 2:22. The last name is the more common name, the beast. The beast. Revelation 11, verse 7. Revelation 11, verse 7 is one example. Of these 5 New Testament names, notice 3 come from the writings of Paul, all in one chapter, 2 Thess 2. 2 Thess 2 is the only place he involves himself with this person. The last 2 names are both by the Apostle John, one in the first epistle and one is in Revelation. So we begin to see the beginnings of the counterfeit. The true son has a multiplicity of names and titles, and the counterfeit son also has a multiplicity of names and titles. Now, for the origin of the Antichrist, let's begin with Genesis chapter 3. The true son has both a supernatural and natural origin. As to his supernatural origin, he was supernaturally conceived by the Holy Spirit when the Spirit generated one of the acts of Miriam or Mary. But then he has a natural origin. He was born of a woman. The same thing was set to see with the Antichrist. He has both a supernatural and a natural origin. As to his supernatural origin, look at chapter 3, verse 15. Chapter 3 is where man falls into sin, and so that's the first place you'll find in Messianic prophecy, since the Messiah is coming for the purpose of dealing with the human sin. But as we read the verse, notice the first prophecy is not given to Adam or given to Eve. The first prophecy is given specifically to Satan. And he says in verse 15, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. There's the mention of two seeds, the seed of the woman and the seed of Satan. You have the same word used twice in the same verse. You have to understand it the same way, unless there's something in the verse that tells you it cannot be taken that way. Let's focus on the seed of the woman, because by calling the Messiah the seed of the woman breaks the normal biblical norm. Because you look at genealogies, they give the male line. In most genealogies, women are never mentioned, and others with the mention are mentioned only in passing, not directly relevant to the genealogy itself. Well, without being told why, for some reason, in the case of the Messiah, he will not be reckoned after the seed of the man, but the seed of the woman. Now, Moses does not tell us why that has to be true, and that won't be revealed to us until Isaiah the prophet comes along. And Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, Isaiah 7:14 prophesies, when Messiah comes, he'll be conceived and born of a virgin. All of us here have received our humanity both from a biological father and a biological mother. With the Messiah, his whole humanity comes from only one biological source, and that is the mother. He has no biological father. And therefore, he only has one biological parent. With him, you have no choice. You have to reckon the seed after the seed of the woman. So what we understand by the word seed is there'll be a supernatural conception of the Messiah, as Isaiah 7:14 prophesied. You also have the seed of Satan that needs to be understood the same way, a supernatural conception. And what that means is that Satan will someday impregnate a woman to give birth to a seed. Now, something similarly happened in chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And in chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, Satan and many of his fallen angels take on human form. Whenever angels appear, they always appear as young men. Never as old men, never as women, always as young men. So they appear as young men and intermarry with human women, producing the race of the Nephilim. And the Nephilim were finally destroyed by Noah's flood. Now, what was done in general in chapter 6 to avoid the seed woman being able to come? Because chapter 6 is Satan's response to chapter 3. In chapter 3, God told them, the son of woman that you tempt will someday come to defeat you. So that's what he tries to do in chapter 6, is to corrupt the seed of woman to keep the Messiah from coming. And came close to succeeding, but God intervened, and there was one line that was spared that intermarriage, the line that Noah came from. What happens in the future is that Satan won't have one of his other fallen angels do it. He'll take on the form and impregnate a woman and produce his seed. So there will be a supernatural conception. He'll be of the seed of Satan. That's why we mentioned in 2 Thess chapter 2, verse 8. 2 Thess 2, verse 8, it says his coming is with the power, but the Greek word is to energize, with the energizing of Satan. As to his natural origin, go to Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. After 72 shall the Messiah be cut off and shall have nothing. And now comes the next phrase that we're after. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and then there shall be with a flood. Even the full end shall be wrought, that's determined, and he shall make a firm covenant. As we saw earlier in our studies today, the one who makes a covenant in verse 27 is the Antichrist. And the pronoun he goes back to his nearest antecedent, which is found in verse 26 as the prince that shall come. The prince that shall come. In other words, the prince that shall come in verse 26 and the he who makes a covenant in verse 27 is the same individual. But in our circles is simply as the Antichrist. But Daniel uses a definite article, the prince, a specific one, because he spoke of him twice before, in Daniel 7 and again in Daniel chapter 8. But notice it's not the prince that shall come that will destroy the city and the temple. It's the people that out of which he comes. The people out of which he descends from destroy the city and the temple. So we can determine exactly who destroys the city and the temple historically. That will tell us what ethnic group he comes from. And that's a matter of history. The year 70 was the Romans who destroyed the city and the temple. That means that the Antichrist will be a Gentile or Roman origin. A Gentile or Roman origin. So it'll be a Gentile woman that will be impregnated by the power of Satan and produce the seed of Satan. So as to his supernatural origin, he's energized by Satan. As to his natural origin, he'll be born of a woman, but a Gentile woman. What you now have is a counterfeit virgin birth and a counterfeit God-man concept. A counterfeit virgin birth and a counterfeit God-man concept. On your outline next is the Antichrist, the start of tribulation. This we already covered. That's in Daniel 9:27. The Antichrist begins with the signing of the tribulation begins with the signing of a 7-year treaty between Israel and the Antichrist. It will not be the rapture that starts the tribulation. The rapture simply precedes it. The starting point is the signing of the 7-year covenant between Israel and the Antichrist. Now next we have in the outline the rise of the Antichrist to power. What the Antichrist will basically do is accept the offer the true Son rejected. And when the true Son was tempted by Satan, Satan offered him his authority over all the kingdoms if the true Son worshipped Satan. But the true Son turned that request down. But the counterfeit Son will accept it. That's why the counterfeit father gives the counterfeit son his authority, his power, and his rule. As to his character, we'll look at 2 passages in Daniel. Let's begin with chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8. And look at verse 23. Daniel 8, verse 23. Another time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance, understanding dark sentences, shall stand up. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper, and shall do his pleasure, and shall destroy the mighty ones and the holy people. And through his policy he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. He shall magnify himself in his heart, and in security shall he destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. Notice several things. In verse 23, Satan will give his son the same power that God gave to Daniel to understand dark sentences. What that means is to be able to solve riddles, deal with the confusion of signs and wonders and so on. And the same power God gave to Daniel to understand dark sentences, to be able to read the writing on the wall, for example, the same ability will be given to the counterfeit son, but this time by Satan. In verse 24, notice it says he has power. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. His power does not originate from him. It originates from his father Satan. Also, verse 24, he will war against the mighty ones and the holy people. In Daniel's context, that would be the Jewish people. And in verse 25, it will be characterized by craftiness and deceitfulness. Elevate those who are following the same basic policy of deceit and craft. The second passage to look at is chapter 11 of Daniel. Daniel chapter 11, verse 36. Now, verse 36 points out two things. He's characterized by willfulness and self-exaltation. The king shall do according to his will. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, but that which is determined shall be done. And notice willfulness and self-exaltation, self-exalting himself above every god. Furthermore, he'll even, in verse 37, move into self-deification. Neither will he regard the gods of his fathers. If you read in the King James Version, it says he shall not regard the God, capital G-O-D, of his fathers. But within the Hebrew text, every reference to God between verses 36 and 39, 36 and 39 is in the singular, referring to a true God. But in the Hebrew text in verse 37, he goes from singular to plural. The correct rendering, as my rendering here, is he will not regard the gods of his fathers. And the point is, he would not follow the pagan gods that his ancestors followed. The ancestors, of course, from his mother's side. No, not only will he not respect the gods of his ancestors, he will not regard any god. Notice, for he shall magnify himself above all. He'll claim to be God himself, as we saw in 2 Thess chapter 2. This does not mean he will not honor anyone, because verse 38 says, but in his place he shall honor the God of fortresses. A God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. And therefore what the God he will honor will be his own father Satan. So he won't worship the true God, he won't worship any pagan gods, he worships Satan specifically. And because he worships Satan, the God he worships, he's empowered by the same God. Verse 39, he shall deal with the strongest of fortresses by the help of a foreign God. Who acknowledges him, he will increase with glory. He shall cause them to rule over many, and he shall divide the land for a price. So those who acknowledge him as their God, those he will elevate. Those who reject this deity, of course, will be destroyed by him. We might add as to his nature the two things we learned from the 2 Thess passage earlier. In 2 Thess chapter 2, verse 8, he's called the lawless one. And in verse 9, he's energized by Satan. As he begins his world takeover, he'll go through political control. And this we saw previously this morning. Remember in Daniel chapter 7, verse 23 and 24, Daniel 7, 23 and 24, he will war against the 10 kings, he'll kill 3, and the other will submit to him. And the fact the others submit to him, we saw Revelation 17, verses 12, 13, and 17. Chapter 17, verses 12, 13, and 17. After taking political control, he will also take over religious control. And we do this in 3 ways. One we saw earlier today. He will destroy this one world religion. Revelation 17, verse 16. Revelation 17, verse 16. And we saw in chapter 7, verse 25. 7:25. He'll war against the saints, the believers of that day. But third way he will begin to take over religious control is that killing the 2 witnesses in Revelation 11, verse 7. Revelation 11, verse 7. And others had tried to kill them previously but failed. He will succeed where others have failed, and because of his success, people will indeed think that he's truly God and begin to worship him because of it. Now, Daniel 11, verses 40 to should be Roman numeral 5 on page 2, the death and resurrection of the Antichrist. Let me just again summarize what we talked about this before this morning. In chapter 11 of Daniel, verses 40 through 45, it describes the war that will happen at the midpoint of the tribulation when the Antichrist will war against all 10 kings. And again, that war, he'll kill 3 of them, and the 3 kings we noted was the king of the north, the king of the south, and the king of the east. And the king of the north is Syria, the king of the south is Egypt, and the king of the east will be Mesopotamia. At that point, the other 7 kings will merely submit to his authority. And then we already surveyed Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. Let me summarize what the teachings was in Revelation 13, verses 1 through 8. We saw in verses 1 and 2 that the counterfeit father will give his authority to the counterfeit son. In verse 3, in the war against the 10 kings, he is killed, but then he's resurrected back to life by the power of Satan. And in verse 4, that's when the world begins to worship him. They see his death and resurrection and see that as evidence, authentication, that he is indeed who he claims to be, God himself. So verse 4, people begin to worship him around the world. And in verses 5 and 6, he's allowed to have full control of the world for 3.5 years. And that'll be the second half of the tribulation. In verse 7, he'll war against the saints. And in verse 8, again, the world worships him. So what we have here is the counterfeit death and resurrection. The counterfeit death and resurrection of the Antichrist. Let's say a few more things about the next thing you have learned, the abomination of desolation. We said some things earlier, but some things we didn't deal with yet. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 9. We noted in this passage that the abomination of desolation happens at the midpoint of the tribulation when the Antichrist breaks his covenant of security with the people of Israel. It doesn't tell us exactly what the abomination is at this stage, simply something that is going to be committed in connection with the takeover of the Jewish temple. The word abomination is a common Hebrew word connected with idolatry. A common Hebrew word connected with idolatry. Let's go to a passage we didn't see before, chapter 12, verse 11. Chapter 12, verse 11. And here he writes this in verse 11 of chapter 12. From the time that the continual burnt offering shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now keep in mind that the second half of the tribulation is exactly 1,260 days. But the abomination is allowed to continue for an additional 30 days beyond the end of tribulation. It'll be there for 1,290 days. Now, it doesn't say anything about what the abomination is, but he points out it's something that is erected, like an image would be erected. Then we also looked at Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 and 16, where we learned that the abomination of desolation will serve as a sign for the Jewish people or the true nature of the Antichrist, and that will cause Israel to flee the land. The abomination of desolation inaugurates the satanic goal of Jewish annihilation to avoid the second coming. And so for that reason, the Jews begin to flee the land. Another passage we looked at was Revelation 11, verse 1 and 2. Revelation 11, verse 1 and 2, we noted it also comes in connection with the Gentile retaking of Jerusalem and the temple. The Gentile retaking of Jerusalem and the temple. Now those passages so far do not specify exactly what the abomination is. And then we saw, it comes in two stages, and we saw the first one in our earlier study this morning in 2 Thess chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. 2 Thess 2, 3 and 4, where Satan, where the Antichrist will sit in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God. He sits in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God. So the breaking of the covenant and the forced cessation of the sacrificial system, he will sit in the Holy of Holies, declare himself to be God Almighty, and call upon the whole world to worship him as God. That's only the first stage of the abomination of desolation, because we know from the passages he will not remain in Jerusalem. He'll set up his world political and economic capital in the rebuilt city of Babylon. So what will he use in place of his own being there? Let's go back to Revelation 13. The main thing to pick up here, because we already went through the passage earlier, is that part of the signs and wonders, he specifies that the counterfeit spirit will make an image of the counterfeit son. And through satanic power, he'll cause this image to become alive. And verse 15 says, it was given unto him to give breath to it, in the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many as should not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And this image will be erected into the Holy of Holies of the temple, and this image will be allowed to stay in there for that 1,290-day period before it's finally eliminated in that 75-day period between the end of the tribulation and the start of the Messianic kingdom. Another thing in your outline, which I already covered in detail, is the mark of the beast. This is the counterfeit seal. As I mentioned, that seal is not a system for banking or credit card system or anything like that. It's specifically giving people merely the right to make a living. So those who worship the Antichrist will take the mark on their right hand or on their forehead, and that's become a very visible sign. It's not a chip, by the way, because a chip requires to go underneath the skin, but the Greek word is epi, upon the skin. It'll be very visible as soon as you can see it. So they're very visible who worship the Antichrist, who does not. Also, the 5 clues he provided in verses 7 and 18 give us the numerical value of his name. So if whatever his name is, you put down the Hebrew letters, that will go to 666. In the way that I explained earlier. There's no way to determine it up front because different combinations of letters can equal 666. Let's just take the number 6. 3 and 3 is 6. So is 2 and 4, so is 4 and 2. So is 5 and 1, so is 1 and 5. In all those combinations, we write different letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So you cannot sit down even on a computer and figure out what his name will be. But once a prominent figure arrives, and you can put his name into Hebrew letters, the number will equal 666. Like I said earlier, I can take anybody's name here and give them the numerical value of your name. So you're still wanting to know if you might be a candidate for the office of this person, just see me in the break or whatever. I'll be happy to figure out the numerical value of your name and see if you qualify. Another thing we already covered is the revelation of the Antichrist. Let me just summarize what we learned from 2 Thess 2. There'll be two different revelations as to the identity of the Antichrist. The first one is for believers before the tribulation, before the day of the Lord, before the tribulation. So before the tribulation, believers will know what the Antichrist is. If this is before the rapture, then it will be church saints. If it's after rapture, it will be post-rapture saints. But saints will know what the Antichrist is, either by numerical value of his name, or simply by the impending announcement of a coming 7-year covenant to be signed between him and the Israel, guaranteeing Israel's military security. And the second revelation is in connection with the abomination of desolation. And that happens in the middle of the tribulation. That's on behalf of the Jewish people. And that revealed to them the true nature and caused them to immediately begin to flee the land before the massive Nazi-like killing begins. Okay, one more thing which we have now dealt with, we can deal with here. The fall of the Antichrist will come in two stages. We saw in 2 Thess chapter 2 verse 8, 2 Thess chapter 2 verse 8, that the first casualty of the second coming is going to be the Antichrist. And the second coming will be the first one killed. Now turn with me to Isaiah chapter 14. Isaiah chapter 14. Isaiah chapter 13 and 14 is speaking about the destruction of Babylon, but not the Babylon of history, but the Babylon of prophecy, because these prophecies, the details of this prophecy have never yet been fulfilled. And when Medo-Persia conquered Babylon, Babylon was not destroyed, it was taken intact. And Darius was put in charge of Babylon. Among his three presidents was Daniel. Further, if you look at chapter 13, verse 6, it gives the timing of this event. Wail ye, for the day of Jehovah is at hand. Then in verse 9, behold, the day of Jehovah comes cruel, wrath, fierce anger. So he's dealing with an event that would happen within the tribulation, within the day of Jehovah. That's the timing of these events. And again, the day of Jehovah throughout Scripture is always a time of divine wrath before the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. And that's why it mentions in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 14 that the connection with Babylon's future destruction will be the final regathering, the final restoration of the people of Israel in the promised land. And this prophecy that was described here has not yet taken place. Now, then he deals with the king of Babylon, which in the future will be the Antichrist. And most of it describes what happens to his soul in death. Verse 4, and you shall take up this parable against the king of Babylon and say, how has the oppressor ceased, the golden city ceased? Jehovah has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers, that smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, with the ruled the nations in anger, with persecution and unrestrained. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet, they break forth into singing. Yet the fir trees rejoice at you, and the cedars of Lebanon sing, since you are laid low, no ewer has come up against us. Sheol from beneath is moved for you to meet you at your coming. It stirs up the dead for you, even all the chief ones of the earth. It is raised up from their thrones, all the kings of the nations. All they shall answer and say unto you, are you also become weak as we? Are you become like unto us? That your palm is brought down to Sheol, and the noise of your vials. The worm is spread under you, and the worms cover you. And the picture is that as the Antichrist is killed, again the first casualty of the second coming, his soul goes into the realm of the hillside of Sheol. And all the kings that already were dead and they're already, they rise up in astonishment that the Antichrist has suffered the same demise as they did. He that claimed to be God has suffered the same demise as they have. And so verses 4 to 11 describe the soul of the Antichrist as it enters into hell. Then verses 12 to 14 provides the background to the fall of the counterfeit son by describing the fall of the counterfeit father previously. It says in verse 15, yea, you shall be brought down to show the utmost parts of the pit. They that see you will gaze at you, they shall consider you, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms, that made the world as a wilderness, and overthrew the cities thereof, and let not loose his prisoners to their homes? All the kings of nations, all of them sleep in glory, every one in his own house. But you are cast forth away from your sepulchre, like an abominable branch, clothed with the slain that are thrust through with the sword, that go down to the stones of the pit, as a dead body trodden underfoot. You shall not be joined with them in burial, because you have destroyed your land and slain your people. The seed of evildoers shall not be named forever. What he describes here is that after the Antichrist is killed, his soul enters into hell. The body of the Antichrist is simply being trampled upon by his own fleeing soldiers. And he points out that the Antichrist will never see burial. He will never see burial. Now, it doesn't say why he won't see burial. He will never see burial. We finally find out why by going to Revelation chapter 19. Revelation chapter 19. Chapter 19, verse 19. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat upon the horse and against his army. The beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrote the signs in his side, where he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. They too were cast alive into lake of fire that burns with brimstone. The rest of the dead were killed with a sword and so on. One reason why the body of the Christ will not see burial is because he'll be resurrected from the dead again, but this time by the Messiah. And two members of the counterfeit Trinity will be cast into lake of fire. If you're Baptist, I'll be by total immersion. And they'll be cast in the lake of fire, and they'll have the lake of fire all to themselves for the first 1,000 years of its habitation. Nobody will join them until 1,000 years have passed. And we'll discuss that in the final lesson. And as far as the other member of the counterfeit Trinity, the counterfeit father, in chapter 20, verses 1 through 3, he won't be joining them just yet in the lake of fire, but he'll be put into the abyss. And the abyss is a section of Sheol or Hades, which is always a temporary place of confinement for fallen angels or demons. A temporary place of confinement for fallen angels or demons. And that's where he will be cast down to for the 1,000-year kingdom. And so unbelieving humanity will be in hell. Satan will be in the abyss. The other two members of the entering the lake of fire. But demons won't be there with Satan, because demons will be confined in two other places here on earth, southern Iraq and southern Jordan, ancient Edom and ancient Babylon. And both areas would be land of burning pitch and burning brimstone. and demons will be confined in these two localities. Ultimately, they'll end up in the same place, but in our last session, what we're going to do is deal with the events that follow the kingdom, and then deal with the eternal Lord as far as the Bible chooses to reveal information about it. So we're having the break now, is that it? Okay.
We'll have 10 minutes.